Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this live stream for Windows Server 2003. Just share my screen, share. Okay, IP config lease options. IP config has some options that make it particularly handy for DHCP clients. The renew and the / release switches. These switches allow you to request renewal of or give up your machine's existing address lease. This might not seem that useful because you can essentially do the same thing by toggling the obtain an IP address automatically button in the Internet Protocol TCP/IP properties dialog box, but it is useful especially when you're setting up a new network. For example, we spend about a third of our time teaching MCSE classes, usually in temporary classrooms set up at conferences, hotels, and so on. Laptops are used in these classes with one Brawny laptop set up as a DNS DHCP DC server. Occasionally, a client will lose its DHCP lease or not get one, perhaps because a cable has become loose, and the quickest way to fix is to pop open a command live window and quickly type ipconfig / renew. In addition, you can configure DHCP to assign options only to certain classes. Classes are defined by you or another administrator as groups of computers that require identical DHCP options. The / set class ID. Class ID switch is the only way to assign a machine to a class. More specifically, the switches do the following. ipconfig / renew instructs the DHCP client to request a lease renewal. If the client already has a lease, it requests a renewal from the server that issued the current lease. This is equivalent to what happens when the client reaches the half-life of its lease. If the client doesn't currently have a lease, the process is identical to what happens when you boot a DHCP client for the first time. It initiates the DHCP meeting dance, listens for lease offers, and chooses one it likes. ipconfig / release forces the client to immediately give up its lease by sending the server a DHCP release notification. The server updates its status information and marks the client's old IP address as available, leaving the client with no bound to its network interface. When you use this command, most of the time it will be immediately followed by ipconfig / renew. The combination releases the existing lease and gets a new one, probably with a different address. It's also a handy way to force your client to get a new set of settings from the server before lease expiration time. ipconfig / class ID sets a new class ID for the client. You will see how to configure class options later in this chapter in the section setting scope options. For now, you should know that the only way to add a client machine to a class is to use the ipconfig / set class ID command. Note that you need to renew the client lease for the class assignment to take effect. Understanding scope details. By now, you should have a good grasp of what a lease is and how it works. To properly learn how to configure your servers to hand out those leases, though, you need to have a complete understanding of some additional topics. You can start with a concept of a scope, which is a contiguous range of addresses. There's usually one scope per physical subnet, and a scope can cover a Class A, Class B, or Class C network address. DHCP uses scopes as the basis for managing and assigning IP addressing information. A superscope is an administrative convenience. It allows you to group two or more scopes together, even when they're actually separate. In reality, a superscope is just a list of its child scopes. Microsoft's DHCP snap-in allows you to manage IP address assignment in the superscope, though you must still configure the other scope options individually for each child scope. Each scope has a set of parameters you can configure. These parameters or scope options control what data is delivered to DHCP clients to complete the DHCP negotiation process with a particular server. For example, the DNS server name, default gateway, and default network time server are all separate options that can be assigned. More properly, these settings are called option types. You can use any of the types provided with Windows Server 2003, or you can specify your own. The scope defines what IP addresses could potentially be assigned, but you can influence the assignment process in two additional ways by specifying the following: an IP address within the range that you never want automatically assigned. These addresses are called excluded addresses or exclusions, and they're off limits to DHCP. You typically use exclusions to tag any address that you never want the DHCP server to assign. Any IP address within the range of which you want a permanent DHCP lease. These addresses are known as reservations because they essentially reserve a particular IP address for a particular device. So installing DHCP. Installing DHCP is easy because the Windows Server 2003 installation mechanism is used. Unlike some of the other services you'll see in this book, the actual installation installs just the service and the associated snap-in, starting it when the installation is complete. At that point, it's not delivering any DHCP service, but you don't have to reboot. There are several ways to install Windows Server 2003 networking services components. Exercise 5.1 presents just one method. In the next chapter, you'll see how to install the DNS server component using an alternate method. Both methods would work for either component. Exercise 5.1, installing the DHCP service. 1. Select Start Control Panel, Add or Remove Programs. 2. Click the Add Remove Windows Components icon. The Windows Components wizard opens and lists all of the available components. 3. Select the Networking Services item from the component list and click the Details button. When the subcomponents of Network Services list appears, make sure Dynamic Host Configuration DHCP is selected and click the OK button. 5. Click the Next button to continue the Windows Components wizard. 6. If prompted, enter the path to the Windows Server 2003 distribution files. 7. Click Finish to close the Windows Components wizard. When you install the DHCP server, the DHCP snap-in is installed too. You can open it by using the Start Administrative Tools DHCP command. The snap-in is shown in figure 5.1. So you can see here the DHCP snap-in here for the server. As you can see, it follows the standard MMC model. The left-hand pane shows you which servers are available. You can connect to servers other than the one you're already connected to. Each server contains sub-ordinate items grouped into folders. Each scope has a folder which is named after the scope's IP address range. There also a separate folder, Server Options, that holds options that are specific to a particular DHCP server. Within each scope, there are 4 subordinate views that show you interesting things about the scope, such as the following. The address pool view shows you what the address pool looks like. The address lease view shows one entry for each current lease. Each lease shows the computer name to which the lease was issued, the corresponding IP address, and the current lease expiration time. The reservation view shows you which IP addresses are reserved and which devices hold them. The scope options view list set the options you defined for this scope. Once you've installed a server, your next step is to authorize the DHCP server in Active Directory. We will look at how to do this in the next section. Authorizing DHCP for Active Directory. Authorization, which actually creates an Active Directory object representing the new server, helps keep authorized servers off your helps keep unauthorized servers off your network. Unauthorized servers can cause two separate kinds of problems. They may hand out bogus leases, or they may fraudulently deny renewal requests from legitimate clients. When you install a DHCP server using Windows Server 2003 and Active Directory is present on your network, the server won't be allowed to provide DHCP services to clients until it's been authorized. If you install DHCP on a member server in an Active Directory domain or on a standalone server, you'll have to manually authorize the server. When you authorize a server, you're really adding its IP address to the Active Directory object that contains a list of the IP addresses of all authorized DHCP servers. At start time, each DHCP server queries the directory looking for its IP address on the authorized list. If it can't find the list, or if it can't find its IP address on the list, the DHCP service fails to start. Instead, it logs an event log message indicating that it couldn't service client requests because the server wasn't authorized. Exercise 5.2 shows you how the process to authorize a DHCP server works. Note that this will only work for DHCP servers in Active Directory domains. Exercise 5.2, authorizing a DHCP server. 1. Select Start Administrative Tools, DHCP to open the DHCP snap-in. 2. Right-click the server you want to authorize and choose the Authorize command. 3. Wait for a short time, 30 to 45 seconds, to allow the authorization to take place. 4. Right-click the server again. Verify that the unauthorized command appears in the pop-up menu. This indicates that the server is now authorized. Creating and managing DHCP scopes. You can use any number of DHCP servers on a single physical network if you divide the range of addresses you want assigned into multiple scopes. Each scope contains a number of useful pieces of data, but before you can find out what they are, you need to understand some additional terminology. Can you perform any of the following steps to manage DHCP scopes? Create a scope, configure scope properties, configure reservations and exclusions, set scope options, active and deactive scopes, create a super scope, create a multicast scope, integrate dynamic DNS and DHCP. We will look at each step in the following sections. Creating a new scope. Like many other things in Windows Server 2003, the process of creating a new scope is driven by a wizard. The overall process is simple, as long as you know beforehand what the wizard is going to ask. If you think about what defines a scope, you will be well prepared. You need to know the following: the IP address range for the scope you want to create, which IP addresses, if any, you want to exclude from the address pool, which IP addresses, if any, you want to reserve, values for the DHCP options you want to set, if any. This last item isn't strictly necessary for creating a scope because the wizard doesn't ask for any options. However, to create a useful scope, you need to have some options to specify for the clients. To create a scope, select a DHCP server in the DHCP snap-in and use the action new scope command. That starts the new scope wizard. We will look at each page of the wizard in the following sections. Setting the screen name. The welcome page of the wizard tells you what you've launched the new scope wizard. The scope name page allows you to enter a name and description for your scope. These will be displayed by the DHCP snap-in, so it's a good idea to pick a sensible name for your scopes so that other administrators will be able to figure out what the scope is for. Defining the IP address range. The next page, the IP address range page, figure 5.2, is where you enter the start and end IP address for your range. This wizard does minimal checking on the address you enter, but it does automatically calculate the appropriate subnet mask for the address range you enter. You can modify the subnet mask if you know what you're doing. So you can see here, figure 5.2, the IP address range page of the new scope wizard. Adding exclusions. The add exclusions page, figure 5.3, allows you to create exclusion ranges as part of the scope creation process. To exclude one address, put it in the start IP address field. To exclude a range, fill in a start and end address. Remember, you can always add exclusions later, but it's best to include them when you create the scope so that no excluded addresses are ever passed out to clients. Setting a lease duration, figure 5.4, allows you to set the lease duration. By default, new leases start with a duration of 8 days and 0 hours. You may find that a shorter or longer duration makes sense for your network. If your network is highly dynamic with lots of arrivals, departures, and moving computers, set a short lease duration. If it's less active, make it longer. Remember that renewal attempts begin when half of a lease period is over, so don't set them too short. So you can see here, figure 5.4, the lease duration page of the new scope wizard. Configuring basic DHCP options. The configure DHCP options page allows you to choose whether you want to configure basic DHCP options, including the default gateway and DNS settings. If you choose to configure these options, you'll have to go through some additional pages which are discussed in the following sections. If you choose not to configure options, you can go back and do so later. If you choose to take that route, make sure you don't activate the scope until you've configured the options you want assigned. So I'm going to leave it here today for this live stream. Thanks for listening and have a good evening. Thank you.